They pitched Jamaica as a postcard paradise, white sand beaches, reggae beats, and million-dollar sunsets. But if you look past the palm trees, you find a completely different island. This version was built in silence by a succession of wealthy families who grasped one brutal truth. If you don't control the supply chain, the real estate, and the access points, you don't control the future. Tonight, we are peeling back the curtain on a secret blueprint of power. It is the story of a tight-knit circle of outsiders who showed up with barely a dime, mastered the rules faster than the locals, and started steering the economy from the back room. We aren't just talking about cash here. We are talking about leverage, legacy, and the invisible hands deciding who gets ahead and who gets left in the dust. Way before luxury resorts turned the coastline into a cash machine, and long before famous brands became national icons, a wave of exiled merchants slipped into the Caribbean looking for safety. They found more than just a hideout, they found an opening. They saw a place where global trade routes could be hacked, where a handshake was currency, and where sticking together as a family meant outlasting any storm raging outside. They didn't chase fame right out of the gate. They built networks. They didn't care about headlines. They bought influence, deal by deal. As Jamaica evolved, their footprint expanded quietly into city blocks, shipping warehouses, storefronts, and the boardrooms that dictated the price of progress. In this series, we are tracking the rise of 10 dynasties, each serving as a chapter in a massive playbook on turning survival into domination. Some constructed entire neighborhoods, others turned local goods into global status symbols. Some held power so discreetly you would never hear their names, yet you feel their impact every time you drive down a highway, pour a drink, or book a hotel room. And sitting at the very peak, one wealthy clan didn't just grow a corporation, they helped design modern Jamaica. Before we jump in, let me know where you are watching from. If you are in North America, type 1 in the comments. If you are in the Caribbean, type 2. If you are tuning in from anywhere else in the world, type 3. And if you want more deep dives into hidden empires, luxury lineages, and the families who move the world without asking for permission, hit subscribe and smash that like button right now, because Chapter 2 kicks off with the original builders who turned Exile into a business advantage. They didn't show up waving flags or leading armies. They came with account books, Rolodexes, and instincts sharpened by survival. For that first wave of settlers, Jamaica wasn't a paradise, it was a calculated gamble. Persecution had taught them a tough lesson. Safety doesn't come from promises, it comes from leverage. Every dock, every cargo crate, and every agreement mattered, because the family that controls the movement controls the outcome. These early arrivals grasped something the colonial elites missed. Real power doesn't have to be loud, it just needs to be connected. They embedded themselves into the trade arteries linking Europe, the Americas, and the Caribbean. They quietly financed shipments, extended credit, and figured out which goods never stopped moving, even during chaos. Sugar, coffee, the essentials. While everyone else chased titles, they chased the cash flow. Within a single generation, more than one family unit had flipped their exile into a major operational edge. What made them different wasn't just discipline, it was unity. Business wasn't a solo sport, it was a family strategy. Sons were taught to negotiate before they were old enough to inherit. Marriages were about cementing alliances. They took losses as a team and reinvested profits as a unit. When markets crashed or policies shifted, they didn't scatter, they circled the wagons. In a volatile colony, that cohesion was their armor. They were also masters of the pivot. When one trade slowed down, they shifted gears. When laws got tight, they found the loopholes. When the competition failed, they bought them out quietly. Over time, warehouses replaced shops, contracts replaced cash, and influence replaced visibility. By the time Jamaica started to modernize, these networks were indispensable gears in the machine. A wealthy dynasty didn't need the applause. The system itself depended on them. This wasn't a takeover by force, it was a takeover by patience. The foundation of everything that came later, cities, industries, empires, was poured in this era by families who knew the long game always belongs to the people willing to wait. Trade was the first battleground, and the seaport was the trophy. Whoever ran the docks owned the information, the pricing, and the timing. The early networks grew from simple buying and selling into full-scale coordination, connecting inland farmers to offshore ships and linking credit on one continent to demand on another. A family that mastered logistics didn't need to own the plantations. They could profit from everyone else's labor without ever owning the soil. These families positioned themselves right between worlds. European factories needed raw materials, Caribbean growers needed buyers, the colonial government needed stability. By funding the shipments and smoothing out the transactions, the merchants became essential. They spoke multiple languages, navigated different legal codes, and thrived in the gray areas. When shortages hit or crises flared up, they were the ones who could keep goods moving when everyone else stalled. That reliability built trust, and trust built leverage. Pretty soon, more than one wealthy clan was setting the terms instead of accepting them. As the trade volume grew, so did the ambition. Profits weren't blown on flashiness. They were poured back into infrastructure storage depots, transportation, insurance, and credit instruments that lowered risk and ramped up scale. These systems quietly locked the competition out. If you wanted access to markets, you went through them. If you wanted a good deal, you worked on their timeline. Influence flowed not from public titles, but from private coordination executed with precision. What looked like commerce was actually architecture. Step by step, the trade empires built the economic skeleton that modern Jamaica would flesh out later. Roads, towns, and industries sprang up along the capital pathways they had already charted. By the time the world started paying attention, the rules were written, the routes were set, and a wealthy family was already sitting at the center of the exchange. Land was the next play, and sentiment had nothing to do with it. Ownership meant permanence. While others viewed acreage as a status symbol, these operators saw it as a control panel. Own the ground, and you dictate what gets built, grown, or moved across it. A family that acquired land strategically wasn't chasing prestige. They were locking in tomorrow's bargaining power. Plantations, mills, storage yards, and transport corridors started clustering under quiet ownership. Sugar and coffee brought in cash, but land brought in options. If prices dipped, holdings could be leased. If demand surged, production could scale instantly. Even political shifts couldn't break this advantage because property outlasts policy. Over time, entire districts relied on decisions made in private rooms, where contracts mattered more than speeches. More than one wealthy family discovered that land was the safest vault money could buy. What followed was a subtle reshaping of space itself. Towns expanded along routes they controlled. Housing appeared near assets they already owned. Jobs tied communities to enterprises that seemed local but were orchestrated through layered holdings. This wasn't dominance through force, it was dominance through design. The physical layout of the island began to mirror financial logic shaped by families thinking decades ahead. By the time modernization rolled around, the chessboard was already set. New industries didn't pick locations at random, they followed the infrastructure that had been quietly prepared. Roads led to properties, properties led to businesses, and businesses reinforced influence. A wealthy family didn't need to announce their power when it was embedded in the land beneath everyone's feet. Failure is where the story should have ended. Instead, it became the turning point. One ambitious operator lost everything in a single stroke, ships destroyed, capital wiped out, reputation erased overnight. Stranded, far from home with no safety net and zero sympathy, the situation exposed a brutal truth about wealth. It isn't what you own, it is what you do when ownership disappears. For a wealthy family, a collapse isn't the end of the game. It is a test of imagination. Cut off from familiar markets, opportunity appeared in a disguise. Resources overlooked by others and risks avoided by the cautious became the next wager. With nothing left to protect, the decision-making changed. Calculated aggression replaced preservation. What followed was not luck, but precision, reinvesting scarce capital into assets that multiplied quietly, far from the scrutiny of established players. Within years, the comeback was undeniable. A wealthy family that had once been written off returned with more leverage than before. The shockwaves traveled fast. Back home, competitors struggled to figure out how total ruin had transformed into dominance. The lesson was clear but uncomfortable. Resilience compounds faster than capital. Loss had stripped away fear, leaving clarity. Instead of rebuilding the old structure, an entirely new one emerged, diversified, insulated, and harder to dismantle. This was no longer just a merchant story. It was a myth made real. When the return finally happened, it wasn't modest. Properties were acquired in bulk. Enterprises were absorbed, not advertised. Influence followed investment, not personality. What the public saw was success. What they missed was the formula behind it. Strategic risk, emotional control, and collective discipline inside a wealthy family that refused to accept defeat as permanent. Let's talk about how a simple drink transformed into a massive global power move. Rum didn't stay just some leftover sludge from the sugar process. It became a statement piece. By dialing in the flavor profile, nailing the consistency, and mastering the branding, these guys turned a rough local moonshine into a worldwide symbol of high status. We are talking about a shift from backyard craft to industrial-grade perfection, from old habits to repeatable excellence. When a wealthy family figured this out, they weren't just peddling alcohol anymore. They were exporting their identity, baking their reputation into every single barrel that left the dock. The real killer app wasn't just the taste, though. It was having total control over the standards. By tightening up their methods, locking down supply chains, and getting foreign buyers to trust them, these producers effectively decided what authentic rum was supposed to be. Competitors either fell in line or went out of business. Their distribution web expanded, the labels became prestigious, and the island's name hitched a ride with every shipment. For one dynasty after another, that bottle became a diplomatic passport, getting them into rooms where nobody knew their names before. Behind the curtain, they ran a tight ship with that same level of discipline. They didn't blow the cash. They poured profits right back into better warehouses, smarter logistics, and marketing that cemented their top dog status. While everyone else was chasing volume, they were obsessed with protecting their margins. While trends flipped back and forth, they anchored themselves to quality. That kind of patience builds a brand that survives for generations, totally immune to political coups or economic crashes. What looked like old-school tradition was actually a corporate strategy, executed in slow motion. Once the demand blew up, political clout followed right behind it. These enterprises started dictating the job market, the farming landscape, and how the rest of the world saw them. Jamaica wasn't just making rum, it was defining the entire category. This success wasn't about one charismatic boss, it was about a structure built to last. The families who really understood legacy ensured that even when consumer tastes evolved, the keys to the kingdom stayed firmly in their pockets. Now, tourism didn't start out as some glitzy luxury thing. It started because they needed the money. When the old industries slowed down and the world looked away, a new door opened, selling an experience instead of a product. Sunshine, ocean water, privacy, and safety became commodities, packaged up for outsiders with cash to burn. The smart money realized early on that tourism isn't hospitality, it is infrastructure. If you controlled the trip from the airport arrival to the departure gate, the revenue becomes boringly predictable. The big breakthrough wasn't the size of the operation, it was the business model. By bundling the room, the food, the fun, and the ride into one decision, they took the risk off the tourist and put it on the operator. Cash flow smoothed out. Staffing became a science. The marketing stopped talking about price and started talking about feelings. The competition blinked, the government took notes, and the travelers ate it up. Overnight, a dying sector turned into an economic engine, driven by design rather than luck. More than one rich family watched this blueprint completely reshape the island's future. Once the foundation was solid, they hit the gas. Resorts popped up everywhere, supply chains tightened, and training systems turned the workforce into pros. Tourism stopped being a seasonal gig and became a permanent industry. Entire coastlines transformed not naturally, but deliberately planned out by heavy capital and a long-term view. What looked like relaxation was actually hardcore logistics at scale. The island's global image shifted, and the economic center of gravity moved right along with it. The biggest payoff was durability. When markets tanked or policies changed, this system just absorbed the shock. Income streams diversified, partnerships grew, and their influence reached into banking, real estate, and services. A family that mastered the resort game wasn't just making money off visitors. They were anchoring the country's stability to an industry they understood better than anyone else. If you want to see real control, look at the cities. Any average Joe can run a shop, but only the titans decide where people sleep, how they get to work, and what a neighborhood looks like. They never treated housing as charity. They treated it like a chess move. By standardizing construction, locking down the financing, and building massive projects, a wealthy family figured out they could solve a national crisis while securing permanent influence. Mass housing flipped the script. Instead of random developments, you had entire grid-planned communities with roads, utilities, schools, and malls ready to go. Construction costs dropped, speed picked up, and homeownership skyrocketed. Where the government struggled to get things done, private coordination delivered. Families moved in, businesses followed, and the population center actually shifted. Quietly, they redrew the map of the country. For the elite involved in this, every poured concrete foundation was an investment in staying relevant. The genius part was the repetition. They refined the designs, optimized the supply lines, and trained labor to work like machines. Every duplicate project lowered the risk and gave them more leverage with banks, insurers, and regulators. These weren't just houses, they were self-sustaining ecosystems designed to keep demand alive for decades. Jobs, retail, transit, it all flowed through developments that felt public but were privately orchestrated. Eventually, the scale made them inevitable. If the city needed to grow, it had to follow the roads they already paved. If laws changed, these existing communities held their value. A wealthy family stopped needing to react to the news. They started anticipating it. By building cities instead of chasing trends, power moved from the balance sheet into daily life, becoming something people relied on without ever asking who drew the blueprints. Real power hardly ever asks for attention. It settles into boardrooms, legal frameworks, and institutions that outlast the news cycle. As these industries matured, influence migrated away from the storefront and into the structures that govern money itself. Media, finance, law, and regulation became the new battlefield. The families who understood this shift didn't chase fame. They positioned themselves where the ink hits the paper on the final deal. Owning a piece of the action replaced owning the whole company. A seat on the board became more valuable than public applause. Through strategic stock buy-ins and advisory roles, these families tweaked pricing, policy, and long-term direction without ever looking like the bad guys. When legislation changed, they had already adapted before the announcement. When the market moved, they were already hedged. Stability wasn't an accident, it was engineered in the quiet by families who preferred staying power over fame. Keeping a low profile created a different kind of security. While politicians rose and fell, institutional influence stayed put. Banks needed their capital. Governments needed their expertise. Industries relied on them showing up. That lack of noise became a shield. Power buried that deep didn't need to defend itself. It was part of the building blocks. What outsiders usually missed was the intention behind it. Being quiet wasn't humility, it was efficiency. If you avoid the spectacle, you minimize the risk. If you stay out of the drama, you keep your leverage. This approach allowed influence to compound over decades, totally immune to trends and insulated from disruption. A wealthy family operating at this level didn't measure success by the year. They measured relevance by the generation. Ultimately, the strongest position isn't looking powerful, it is being unavoidable. When decisions get made, the outcomes are already aligned with interests shaped way back in the day. That is the final evolution of control, not dominance you can point a finger at, but a dependence you can't get rid of. Legacy isn't measured by headlines or short-term wins. It is measured by what is still standing when the crowd moves on. At the final stage of power, expansion slows down and intention gets sharper. Wealth that survives for centuries does so because it stops acting like cash and starts acting like gravity. The families who reach this point know a hard truth. Growth without a purpose eventually falls apart. The real dynasties didn't rely on charisma or dumb luck. They built systems that could outlive individuals' education, pipelines, governance rules, and long-term mandates that valued the group over the ego. Leadership became a duty, not a prize. They made choices with 40 years in mind, not 3 months. Over time, influence blended so deeply into the national fabric that it didn't feel forced. It just felt normal. That is how a wealthy family becomes untouchable. At this level, power gets human. Philanthropy isn't just symbolic, it is tactical. Preserving culture, stabilizing institutions, and funding social programs reinforce the same foundations that protect the money. Communities prosper, trust goes up, and everyone gets on the same page. The most effective influence is the kind people lean on without realizing who built it. That quiet integration isn't accidental, it is deliberate design. The final lesson is simple, but it stings a little. Money alone doesn't make you immortal. Vision does. Discipline does. Patience does. The families who figure this out stop chasing visibility and start shaping the future in ways that feel inevitable. When power looks exactly like progress, it doesn't need to defend itself anymore. If this story changed the way you view wealth, power, and legacy, make sure you smash that subscribe button, like the video, and send it to a friend who values long-term thinking. And let me know in the comments, do you believe true power should be out in the open or hidden in the shadows? Type 1 for visible, type 2 for invisible.